The murder of Betsy Aardsma, 1969, USA. There's a place in central Pennsylvania where the books still remember. Penn State University, November 1969. A 22-year-old graduate student walks down a flight of stairs into the basement stacks of a library, and somewhere between row 50 and row 51, in the space of about 10 minutes, she becomes a ghost story. The campus still hasn't finished telling. It was the Friday after Thanksgiving, and Pattee Library was quiet in the way old buildings get quiet. Not empty, just hushed, the kind of hush that swallows footsteps and small sounds. Betsy Aardsma had spent the holiday with her boyfriend in Hershey, but she'd come back early. There was a paper due, there was research to finish. She was the kind of person who finished things. She walked over with her roommate that afternoon, the two of them splitting off with plans to meet later and catch a movie. Easy Rider, maybe, or take the money and run. Around 4 o'clock, Betsy stopped to talk to one of her professors. A few minutes after that, she ran into two friends near the entrance, chatted briefly, and disappeared through the doors of the library. She left her purse, her jacket, and a book in a study carrel upstairs. She checked the card catalog. She found what she was looking for, and at around 4:30, she walked down a narrow staircase into level 2 of the core stacks. A maze of tight aisles, low ceilings, and a fluorescent hum that didn't quite reach into the corners. That was the last ordinary moment of her life. Somewhere between 4:45 and 4:55, in the dim space between row 50 and row 51, someone was waiting for her, or met her there. Nobody is sure which. One witness nearby said he heard a man and a woman talking quietly. No shouting, no panic, nothing that sounded like a struggle. Just two voices. Then the sound of books hitting the floor. Then something striking the metal shelving. A single thrust of a knife went into Betsy's chest, through her left breast, through her pulmonary artery, into her heart. It was clean. It was almost surgical. And here's the detail that still makes investigators uneasy decades later. There was almost no blood. She was wearing a white turtleneck and a red dress, and the wound bled inward into her own lung instead of out. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her body simply gave out, and she slid down between the shelves, pulling books down on top of herself as she fell, until she was lying on her back in a scatter of pages and dust with no one around her, even realizing what had just happened. A man came running from that aisle. Two students saw him, Joao Uafinda and Marilee Erdley. He was holding his right hand close to his body, like he was hiding something. He told them, almost casually, that girl needs help. Then he led them toward Betsy's body, pointed at her, and walked away. While Erdley dropped to her knees and started CPR, Uafinda tried to chase him. He lost him in the stacks. The man simply folded back into the building and was never seen again. Nobody at the library understood, not yet what they were looking at. The call that went out to the campus health center didn't say stabbing. It said a girl had fainted. Paramedics arrived, performed CPR, wheeled her out on a gurney through a service elevator, and rushed her to Reitnor Health Center, still believing they were dealing with a medical emergency. It wasn't until a doctor examined her that anyone realized Betsy Aardsma had been murdered. By then, it was 5:19 p.m. She was already gone. And because no one had known to treat the stacks as a crime scene, nobody preserved it. Staff cleaned up the fallen books. They mopped the floor. Students kept walking through that aisle while detectives were still trying to understand what they were looking at. Whatever evidence had existed in that narrow corridor between the shelves had already been swept away before the first real investigator arrived. The man who'd led the witnesses to the body was eventually sketched from memory. Brown hair, around 6 feet tall, a sports coat and tie, maybe glasses. That sketch went out. It matched no one. Police questioned thousands of men that winter. They got nowhere. One name kept surfacing, though, and it's the name that still haunts the case. Richard Hafner, a geology graduate student who'd briefly dated Betsy before she ended things, choosing to stay loyal to her boyfriend instead. When investigators interviewed him, he said he'd been eating dinner across campus when he heard the rumors of a murder. He said he felt sick when he learned it was her. He said he'd never set foot in that library. He always got his research material from a different building entirely, but there was an identikit sketch made by a desk clerk that was never released to the press. People who saw it later said it looked unsettlingly like Hafner. Investigators at the time cleared him. He went on living his life, and the case went cold and cold and colder still, the way unsolved things do when the people who worked them retire and the witnesses grow old, and the campus simply moves on around the wound. It wasn't until decades later, long after Hafner had died in 2002, that journalists and authors digging back through the case started building something closer to a real argument against him. Circumstantial. Never enough for an arrest, but enough to make his name the one that won't go away. To this day, nobody has ever been charged. Nobody has ever stood trial. The man who pointed Betsy out to two strangers and then vanished into the stacks has never been identified with certainty. And the aisle where she died, row 50, row 51, is still there in the basement of a building students walk through every single day. Most of them with no idea that more than 50 years ago, a young woman walked into the quiet on a Friday afternoon, and the quiet is what killed her. Bible John, 1968 to 1969, Scotland. There's a dance hall in the East End of Glasgow where three women went to forget their lives for one night and never came home. Between 1968 and 1969, a man who quoted scripture between kisses became the most hunted ghost in Scottish history. They called him Bible John, and he was never caught. The Barrel Inn Ballroom sat out in the Gallowgate, all neon and noise, and on Thursday nights it ran something the regulars called the Secret Over 25's dance. It was an open secret, really. Married men and women slipping their wedding rings off at the cloakroom door, introducing themselves under names that weren't quite their own, buying each other drinks under lighting that made everyone look 20 years younger and infinitely more available. For a few hours every week, the Barrel Inn let ordinary, tired, married Glasgow pretend to be something else. Nobody thought that pretending could get you killed. On February 22nd of 1968, a 25-year-old auxiliary nurse named Patricia Docker went out dancing. She'd been living back with her parents while her husband served overseas, and that Thursday night she decided she needed a few hours away from the walls of her childhood bedroom. She went to the dancing, though even which dance hall she ended up at became a small mystery in itself, since she'd told people one thing and seemed to end up somewhere else. By morning, she was found dead in a lane near a garage not far from her parents' home. She had been beaten and strangled. The investigation went nowhere. Within months, the case had gone quiet, filed away, half forgotten. Just another unsolved tragedy in a big, indifferent city. 18 months passed. Then on the 16th of August 1969, a 31 or 32-year-old mother of three named Jemima MacDonald Mima, to the people who loved her, dropped her three children off with her sister and went out for a night at the Barrel Inn. She was a regular there. People knew her laugh, knew she liked to let her hair down once in a while between the long stretches of raising kids alone. That night, witnesses noticed her getting close to a tall, well-dressed man with reddish hair, somewhere in his late 20s or early 30s. Mima didn't come home that night or the next morning. Days later, neighborhood children playing in a derelict, half-abandoned tenement nearby stumbled onto her body. She had been strangled, sexually assaulted, left somewhere a child could find her. That was when the pattern clicked into place for investigators, the dread certainty settling in that something was hunting the city in a very specific, very patient way. Both women, dark-haired. Both married, both technically out on their own that night, both menstruating at the time of their deaths, both with their handbags and sanitary items deliberately left near their bodies like some kind of grim signature. Both met someone at the Barrel Inn. Both were strangled and left close to their own homes, close enough that, in theory, they'd nearly made it back to safety before whatever happened. Police brought in an artist from the Glasgow School of Art, and built a composite sketch from what witnesses could recall. It went out to the press, the first time in Scottish legal history a murder suspect's likeness was authorized for public release. And still nothing solid came of it. The city held its breath and waited to see whether it had imagined a connection between two unrelated horrors, or whether something was still out there, still hungry. It was Halloween night, the 31st of October 1969, when the answer arrived, and it arrived close enough to touch. Helen Puttock, 29 years old, a mother of two, went out that evening with her sister Jean. Her husband George stayed home with the children, not entirely comfortable with the idea of his wife out dancing while a killer remained loose in the city, but trusting that the two sisters would look out for each other. They started at a pub on Kent Street, then made their way to the Barrowland just after 10. There they fell into conversation with two men. One called himself John. He was tall, fair or reddish-haired, well-spoken, dressed sharply, and strange, in a way Jean would never quite be able to shake from her memory. He talked about his family. He talked about church. He quoted scripture unprompted in the middle of a dance hall full of cigarette smoke and flirtation, condemning the adultery happening all around him even as he stood inside it, even as he danced with a married woman whose ring was tucked away in her purse. At the end of the night, the four of them shared a taxi. Jean got out first, leaving her sister alone in the back seat with the man who called himself John. It was the last time anyone who loved Helen Puttock would ever see her alive. Her body was found early the next morning in a back garden, not far from her own home, in nearly the same condition as the others. Beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, her handbag and a sanitary item left deliberately near her. She had been so close to her own front door, close enough that a few more minutes, a different turn, anything at all might have saved her. Jean Puttock became the most important witness in the case, and possibly in all of Scottish criminal history. She sat with detectives for hours, reconstructing every detail of the stranger who'd called himself John. His manner, his voice, his Glasgow accent, his height, his hair, his strange, sermonizing fixation on sin while standing in a room built for exactly the kind of sin he claimed to despise. From her account and from fragments gathered from the earlier murders, police built a new composite drawing. The press did the rest. They called him Bible John, and the name stuck so completely that it has outlived every theory, every suspect, every false confession for over 50 years. What followed was, at the time, the largest manhunt in the history of Scottish policing. More than 100 detectives, over 50,000 statements taken. Roughly 5,000 men questioned, dragged in, compared against a sketch-and-a-half remembered voice. Taxi drivers were interviewed by the hundreds, trying to retrace exactly how these women had traveled home that final night. An anonymous letter arrived from a woman who may have seen something, who may have known something. Police begged her publicly to come forward. She never did. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stopped. No more bodies. No more sightings at the Barrowland. No more sermons whispered into the ear of a stranger on a dance floor. Bible John simply closed the door behind him and walked back out into the ordinary ticking world, and the world let him go. In the decades since, his name has been pinned to a parade of men who were each in turn cleared. A police officer, some claimed, hiding in plain sight inside the very investigation meant to catch him. A Glasgow man, identified by an old friend, traced as far as the Netherlands, eliminated. Most chillingly, the convicted serial killer Peter Tobin, a man known to have prowled Glasgow in exactly this period, known to have met at least one woman at that very ballroom, became for years the investigation's leading theory. Before his own pattern of burying victims, rather than leaving them out in the open, quietly broke the resemblance apart. DNA, when it was finally tested decades later, came back inconclusive. Time had already taken what evidence there was. To this day, nobody knows who he was. Nobody knows where he went, or why he simply stopped. Somewhere in Glasgow's old records sits a composite sketch of a tall man with reddish hair and a stranger's borrowed name, a man who danced with three women, quoted them verses about sin and judgment, and then walked them, one by one, to the edge of their own front doors and into the dark.